Ik heet iedereen van harte welkom bij dit ronde tafelgesprek over de situatie in Soedan. We hebben 2 blokken met experts. Zij zullen een korte introductie geven van 5 minuten, waarna de Kamerleden vragen kunnen stellen. Ik zal nu wisselen naar Engels, omdat een aantal van onze gasten Engelstalig is. Everyone, welcome to this meeting. Welcome to the experts. Welcome to the members of parliament. We have here the Green Left Alliance, the Socialist Party, DENK, the Democrat 66, the Christian Democrats and Ja21. Thank you for being here today. And I'm from the Party for the Animals. First, I would like to invite the guests to give a short introduction of about 5 minutes. We are short in time, so please stick to the 5 minutes. And then we continue with the questions from the members of parliament. We wait for one of the guests. That is Ms. Zaine Labdin. I think I pronounced it not really well, but my apologies for that. We will wait for her, but in the meantime, we will start already with this round. So first, I would like to give the floor to Maaike Awater. She is here in the name of Stichting Vluchteling. Maaike.
Thank you. 2 weeks ago, I was on my way back from Tawila in Darfur, a town just 60 kilometers from Al Fasher. Al Fasher had been besieged for 18 months by the Rapid Support Forces until they captured it this October. After the fall of Al Fasher, we expected that the more than 250,000 people who had been trapped there for all those months would arrive in Tawila, except fewer than 10,000 did. We do not know what happened to the rest. Satellite images from Yale University showed how the sand of Al Fasher turned red, soaked with blood. Videos posted by the RSF themselves show how innocent men, women and children were attacked, raped and slaughtered. In Tawila, I spoke with several people who had managed to escape. They fled in the middle of the night, carrying as little as possible so they could run as fast as they could. They told us how, in the months before the fall of Al Fasher, food ran out and prices rose so sharply that someone traded a truck for a single bag of rice. Aduma, a man I spoke with, told me how he lost his brother and his leg when an airstrike hit his home and how he had to spend all his savings just to reach the nearest town. An elderly woman managed to escape with her 2 sons who were taken by soldiers along the way, and she could not tell me what happened to him. Those who arrive in Tawila do so without belongings. Hundreds of children have arrived by themselves without relatives or caretakers, most of them malnourished. The camp stretches for kilometers and there's a shortage of everything. There's not enough drinking water, food, shelter, or medical care. People are forced to sleep out in the open, in the scorching heat during the day and in the cold at night. The local community, together with NGOs, is doing everything possible to scale up humanitarian support in Darfur without the usual UN coordination that has largely been absent. But it is not enough. Famine has been confirmed in North Darfur and South Kordofan and will increase drastically as farmers can't harvest their crops. Almost half of the population is facing severe food insecurity. That's more than 21 million people. Many of these people are difficult to reach, for example, due to extreme road conditions that become impossible to cross in the rainy season, numerous checkpoints controlled by different militia, as well as the constant risk of being attacked. Operating safely requires resources that are scarce, and only a third of the required funding for the humanitarian response has been made available, despite Sudan being the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. Even those who manage to flee Sudan do not find safety, but an uncertain future in dire conditions. Only 15.6% of the required funding for the regional refugee response plan has been provided, while nearly 4 million refugees are being hosted in countries like Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Overcrowded refugee camps, shortages of water and food, rising prices, and exhausted host communities are creating tensions. Those who attempt to reach Europe are not met with the protection that international conventions and European law guarantee them. The European Union has signed migration deals with countries that violate human rights and the rights of refugees, including the €1 billion deal with Egypt, where human rights abuses are well documented, and Sudanese refugees, including children, are being pushed back to the war they were trying to escape. The EU continues to cooperate with Libya, despite countless documented cases of Sudanese refugees who have been tortured by Libyan human traffickers. Those who do manage to reach Europe face asylum restrictions, a reception crisis, and political rhetoric that describes them as a threat instead of people in need of protection. While al-Fashir remains cut off from the outside world, we are seeing new cities being besieged in North and South Kordofan, such as Kadugli and Dilling, without effective diplomatic and political pressure on the warring parties and the countries that are supplying them with financial and military support, without humanitarian access and protection and sufficient funding to actors with presence on the ground, there is a real risk that history will repeat itself very soon. Today, I want to emphasize that we were too late in al-Fashir, and we were too late for all the other places in Sudan where similar atrocities have happened in this war against civilians that has been ongoing for over 2.5 years. But I also want to ask you to act now, to prevent this from happening again and again. Uphold international humanitarian law, including protection and access, and leverage the influence of the Netherlands and the EU to end support to the warring parties. We know what is about to unfold, and we are here to discuss what is needed to prevent that from happening. The only remaining question is whether we are willing to take action to prevent it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Awater, in the name of Stichting Vluchteling, for your introduction. And I give a very warm welcome to Ms. Zainul Abdin. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Very warm welcome. I think you want to be here and get used to the atmosphere. So I will give the floor first to Mrs. Garance Reus-Deelder, and she's from Plan International and the Dutch Relief Alliance. And then afterwards, I will give the floor to Ms. Zainul Abdin. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, dear members of Parliament, for being here. The face of the armed conflict in Sudan, for me, will forever be the young woman whom I met in a displaced persons camp in Kasla last October. I talked to her in the coffee corner that Plan International has set up in this camp. This coffee corner is really a center for psychosocial support and medical referral for victims of sexual violence. But if we were to call it that, no woman or girl would dare to come there because the stigma of rape is too great. This young woman had fled the violence in Khartoum, where she had a home and a thriving business. She wandered around for weeks before she ended up in the west of airport camp with her 2 children. Her children were so hungry that along the way they ate the toothpaste that she had packed. She didn't want to tell me exactly what she'd had to do to get food along the way. She only said that she had bled a lot. I sat with her in that hot, dusty tent, and I honestly didn't know what to say. I wished her peace, and I got ready to say goodbye. But it was clear that she still wanted to tell me more and that she was somehow searching for words. And bit by bit, she explained to me the sadness in her eyes. Her 4-year-old daughter was also a victim of sexual violence. As we speak, thousands of women and children like her are seeking help and shelter in the overcrowded and underfunded camps in Darfur and elsewhere in Sudan. Humanitarian organizations are doing all they can, but it is not nearly enough. But there is also a second face of Sudan that I want to honor here, and that is the face of the millions of host families and communities who offer shelter to those in need. Only 10% of the over 13.5 million displaced Sudanese find refuge in regular camps. The vast majority of the displaced are hosted by host communities in their own country, whose resilience and hospitality are remarkable but severely tested. The humanitarian coordinator that I met in the city of Gedaref told me that she took 60 people into her house. Just before curfew, she ran to the bakery to buy at least some bread for them. She's not alone. The solidarity of the Sudanese people is exemplary. They are resilient, but they need and deserve our support to get back on track. The host communities acutely need help now. The water and sewage system is overburdened, so there's a risk of cholera. The schools have to be refurbished and reopened, and the women, who are extra vulnerable to violence and exploitation in such crisis situations, need support to overcome their traumas and start up their shop, their business, or their profession again. As Dutch Relief Alliance, we offer not only immediate humanitarian support in Darfur and other areas, but we also work with communities and local organizations to rebuild lives and to restore livelihoods. But the funding gap for the so-called forgotten, or should I say ignored, crisis in Sudan is huge, while we have the capacity to do much more. So to conclude, the international community is failing to protect the women and children in Sudan. Thousands of violations have been identified, including the recruitment and use of children by armed groups, the killing and maiming of children, sexual violence, attacks on schools and hospitals, abductions of children, and the denial of humanitarian aid. UN Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher estimated that 1 in 5 people killed in Al Fasher were children. Sudan urgently needs you, as parliamentarians, to help achieve 4 things. Firstly, a lasting ceasefire. External, military and political support for the warring parties is the fuel for this conflict. That support must stop, and to achieve that, much more political decisiveness is required. Secondly, humanitarian access. Aid agencies should be provided with safe access based on the principles of neutrality, independence and impartiality, and may I add, humanity, in order to be able to deliver food, water, healthcare, protection and education effectively to those who need it most, without obstruction. Thirdly, sufficient funding in accordance with the scale of this humanitarian crisis, including funding to restore peace and to rebuild lives. For next year, 2026, only 26% of the budget has been secured so far of the $2.9 billion needed for the 33 million people in need. And finally, protection of the rights of women and children. Let me just add, earlier this week, a kindergarten in the town of El Hanan was bombed, a kindergarten, a place that should be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. Over 50 children died. So we need protection of the rights of women and children and a clear guarantee that violations, such as sexual gender-based violence, are documented and that crimes will not go unpunished. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your introduction. Then I would now like to give the floor to Fatima Zaiden Labdin. She is a Sudanese human rights activist and she is from the Sudanese Refugees Organization. The floor is yours.
Members of Parliament, Chairperson and fellow participants, thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is Fatima Zaiden Labdin and I am the Executive Director of Sudanese Refugee Organization, SRO, here in the Netherlands. I speak today not as a humanitarian and a healthcare professional, but as a part of a generation of Sudanese who were building a future, one that was violently interrupted by the conflict that now threatens to destroy our country, and whose humanitarian cost in the focus of my testimony today. So, since April 2023, Sudan has become the site of one of the world's most devastating and underreported humanitarian crises. Over 12 million people have been displaced, many facing famine, siege, and indiscriminate violence. Cities like Al Fasher and Bara are cut off from aid and face starvation. Women and girls are endured systemic sexual violence as a weapon of war, a profound protection failure that demands immediate international action. These are not unfortunate side effects of conflict. They are deliberate strategies of terror and domination carried out by RSF and SAF. The war is not only Sudanese, it is internationally enabled. Arms, gold, and fuel continue to flow, especially through networks based in the UAE. European inaction is not neutral. It is, in effect, complicity. The people of Sudan are not asking for charity. we are asking for principled action that matches the values of Netherlands has always stood for. The Netherlands has always stood for. So in the Netherlands, I work directly with Sudanese refugees, engineers, teachers, doctors, nurses, people who are highly capable but unable to work or study while waiting for asylum decisions. This forced idleness as a trauma is itself. At SRO, we run support group and organize fundraising for affected families. For example, we are currently focusing on sending dignity kits to women in displacement camps. We are filling gaps that governments and large institutions are not addressing. We do it with commitment, but we cannot do it alone. The simplest humanitarian act the Netherlands can take is to allow these capable people to work. One working refugee can support 4 families members back home. It is the most effective form of humanitarian aid. Before this war, we were building our country, creating businesses, social programs, and movement for change. We wanted to do that again, but we need partnership, not pity. We call on the Netherlands to take 5 immediate principled actions. Empower refugee, allow Sudanese refugee to work, and fast-track asylum procedure, recognize this as a vital humanitarian lifeline. Ensure access, support humanitarian corridors, especially to the areas under siege like Al-Fashir. Demands accountability, impose targeted sanction on RSF and SAF leadership and their financial networks. Fund grassroots. Increase direct funding to grassroots Sudanese organizations who are on the true first responders. Invest in the future. Create educational and leadership pathway for Sudanese youth so we ready to rebuild a new Sudan when the time comes. And final word, the future of Sudan will not be determined by the generals. It will be determined by the youth, women, and civil society leaders who have refused to pick up a gun even when the world turned its back. We are still here. We are ready to build a different kind of country, but we cannot do it without manageable support now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking out so clearly. Now we're going to Mr. Kyle McNally, and he's from Artsen zonder Grenzen, Doctors Without Borders. I give you the floor.
Thank you, honorable members, for the opportunity to address you today on the dire humanitarian crisis unfolding in Sudan. I come before you today to emphasize the gravity of the situation, the failures that have allowed it to persist, and the urgent need for transformative action. Before Al-Fashir fell to the Rapid Support Forces, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan was already the largest in the world today and has been for more than 2 years. The situation is catastrophic, with millions of civilians facing acute food insecurity, starvation, and recurring outbreaks. The collapse of Sudan's healthcare system, the systematic obstruction of aid, and the deliberate targeting of civilians has pushed millions to the brink. The violence which took place as the Rapid Support Forces took over Al-Fashir is the latest in a series of grim chapters of this conflict. It is marked by unbridled, ethnically targeted violence, starvation tactics, and mass atrocities, including killings, rampant sexual violence, and forced displacement, all occurring at large and massive scale. Healthcare facilities and humanitarian operations have been attacked, leaving civilians with nowhere to turn and community coping mechanisms under severe strain. This is not just a humanitarian crisis, it is a moral and political failure of collective and global scale. The tragedy of Al-Fashir should shock the conscience, but it should not have come as a surprise. Sudanese voices had long warned that precisely this would happen. And in this way, the fall of al-Fashir represents a remarkable collective failure on multiple fronts. Of course, the warring parties have shown a complete disregard to protect the civilian lives, systematically raping and starving the people that they claim to protect, failing to uphold the most basic obligations that they have under international law and basic humanity. Regional actors and diplomatic partners of the warring parties have failed to act decisively to prevent atrocities and hold perpetrators accountable. The UN's response has been inadequate and woefully disproportionate to the scale of the crisis, and donor funding for the humanitarian efforts struggles to reach frontline providers, who are often the only ones able to access affected areas. Governance bodies, including the UN as well as regional bodies, have failed to prioritize civilian protection or enforce safe humanitarian action. As clashes escalate in the Kordofans today, we are already hearing stories from the displaced and local responders of more horrific violence unfolding. Indeed, the next al-Fashir may already be underway. And yet it's the political and economic interest of the Netherlands and of the European Union which form, at least in part, the arena within which these horrors are allowed to take place, and as we see currently, are apparently allowed to persist with near blanket impunity. Tokenistic policy discussions and consultation sessions without significant concrete action will only perpetuate the impunity. Maintaining the status quo risks an admission of complicity in the atrocities that are certainly to follow. Clearly, the way that diplomatic actors have been approaching this has not worked to date. If we are to break the cycle of violence and suffering, we must commit to transformative action. We must either commit to doing something different and new, or we must brace for more al-Fashirs to come. On access, we must continue to prioritize the humanitarian access of independent of political negotiations. Parties blocking aid must be held to account, and the UN must be encouraged to pursue access in a more principled manner based more on needs than the politics of the day. When it comes to the response efforts, we must defend and advance principled and effective humanitarian action. We must remove barriers that prevent funding from reaching local organizations. These groups are often the only ones able to deliver aid in the most affected areas, and yet they receive minimal support. We must find new ways of getting money to them. We must insist that the UN be present and coordinating, having deployed their most senior staff into these areas, also outside of government control. We must insist that the UN shift from a posture of hyper-compliance and defense of the territorial integrity of the SAF government to one that places the protection of people at the forefront, one that vigorously defends and advances their right to receive assistance. And on protection, we must promote the protection of civilians and enforce safe humanitarian access during conflict. This requires that you, and all states capable of doing so, significantly increase the pressure on warring parties to change their conduct, to rein in their abuses, and to allow unimpeded humanitarian access. Donors and EU member states should wield their influence more effectively and should insist on accountability for the violations taking place, as well as for those that enable this by sending weapons or otherwise fuel this conflict further. Honorable members, I urge you to leave this room prepared to do something different today, to demand things be done differently than how they've been done so far. I urge you to remain unsatisfied with the marginal gains that may fit most neatly with the short-term political economic interests of today, to champion and defend humanitarian access and the protection of civilians. We must do better, we must do more, and we must do it now. The people of Sudan deserve better.
Thank you, Mr. McNally, for your contribution. I would now like to invite the members of parliament to ask their questions, and I suggest that we divide it up in two parts, so that the first three members ask their questions, and then the answers come, and then the next three members ask their questions. Then I first like to give the floor to Ms. Abdi from the Green Left Alliance for her question.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to really thank you for your contributions and for setting out the facts as they are. I think I'm quite taken aback by what I've heard, but I have a few questions to follow up. First, when it comes to complicity, that's something I heard several of you guys mention about the complicity of the EU, from the UN, and other organizations. I'm curious if you could add a bit more detail on that, specifically when it comes to the EU, and also when it comes to the collaboration with Libya. So that's one thing that I want to ask you. Second, when it
Sorry,
comes
who do you want to ask the question to?
to all panelists, when it comes to
To all
complicity.
three, then the answers must be quite short.
Yeah, so
concerning
short.
the time.
So
Yeah.
just specifically on complicity, what you mean with that, a bit more detail in relation also to the collaboration with Libya. The second one is about the entry of weapons and gold. And I think, Fatima, you were mentioning this as well. I'm curious to hear a bit more about detail about that. And the third, to round it up.
Well,
Chair?
I suggest that we do 2 questions max for now, and then later
Yeah.
on we can maybe have time
Out.
for more
Yeah.
questions. So then, Ms. Dobbe, your questions.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your input in this session. I think it's worth a lot for us to have the good debate tomorrow. My question would be: we all hear the stories about the systemic sexual violence against women and children, and I was wondering, what is one of the things that was suggested? Crimes should be documented. Is that also the main thing that we should focus on in order to prevent any further systemic use of weaponizing, basically, of sexual violence of women and girls? I was wondering about that and how we can concretely make that into something that helps against that. And if we can do 2 questions, I have one more. And now you've
Yeah,
started
go ahead.
something.
Go ahead.
You've started something. I was wondering about the role of the UN, because I heard several of the speakers saying that the UN is lacking, that it's not doing what it should be doing. And could you say something more about that? So we can do proposals to urge the UN to take their role more properly.
And to whom do you want to ask the questions to?
We'll work it out. Yeah?
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Thank you. Then Mr. Van Baarle of the Denkparty.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution. I have a question for Ms. Reus-Dilder, because you mentioned the role of host communities and mentioned that 90% of refugees are being hosted by host communities and host families. Do you have any specific proposals for us as to how we can support host families and host communities in receiving refugees? And my second question is for Ms. Awater and Ms. Reus-Dilder, because you both spoke about budgets. Ms. Awater, you mentioned that the budget for helping people in the refugee camps is only 15% of what is needed. Ms. Reus-Dilder, you mentioned that for the next year only 26% of the needed budget is allocated. Could you perhaps tell us more about what these numbers are based on and why it is so urgent and what we could do to organize more means internationally? Thank you.
Thank you. Then I would suggest that you answer the first round of questions. So we start with Ms. Awater.
Yeah, thanks for these questions. On the first question on complicity, I think, in general, I think we've had quite influential relationships as the Netherlands and the EU with countries that are supporting the warring parties, both diplomatically, politically, economically, and we can use that leverage much better, I think, than what we've been seeing up to date. I mean, on the one hand, you want to have kind of that access to those actors for your humanitarian diplomacy for access, but at some point, you also have to wonder if concrete outcomes fail to materialize, there needs to be political consequences also to uphold the legitimacy of international humanitarian law. And that is something that we can very concretely push for as the Netherlands in our bilateral relationships, but also in our relationships as the EU, which are even more so influential. And in our negotiations on trade agreements or any other type of international corporations, we should prioritize human rights obligations, international humanitarian law obligations, and other obligations under international law also related to refugee law, for example, and conventions such as those. And for the specific questions on Libya, it's one of the examples of where we have externalized our responsibility to really host protect refugees. We have decided that we want other countries such as Libya, such as Egypt and others to take that responsibilities to stop migration flows coming to Europe without upholding basic human rights. So we are seeing, and it's very well documented, grave human rights abuses in Egypt, in Libya, of Sudanese refugees and other refugees. And we are not effectively taking that into account in our decision to continue those partnerships. So for us, it should be quite clear that if those countries fail to uphold basic human rights, international humanitarian law, then that should have consequences for that relationship. And otherwise, that does imply some complicity on our part.
Does anybody of the guests wants to add something on the complicity question?
I might just, and first of all, I think that was very well said, and I would agree with that. I might only add that it is not only kind of acts of commission or proactive action that kills. Inaction also kills, right? Acts of omission also kill. Failing to act when you have the opportunity, the ability, and maybe even the obligation to do so, it also kills. People will lose their lives as a result of that inaction, whether it's not choosing to wield influence with a trade deal or otherwise. And so I think it is equally important to recognize that it's not only through our actions that these consequences come, but it's also through the lack of action.
Thank you. Ms. Zainelabdin, you want to add something?
But I want to answer.
Could you please put on your microphone?
I
Yes.
want to answer the question about the UAE, how it's fueling the war. The UAE support for the RSF is primarily channeled through two critical mechanisms: the flow of arms and the provision of a financial lifeline via the gold trade. So the most direct mechanism is the alleged supply of advanced weaponry to the RSF, often in violation of international arms embargoes. The weaponry, the investigation by human rights groups and UN experts have indicated that the UAE has provided the RSF with advanced weaponry, including Chinese-made equipment, which has been observed in the conflict zone. And also the logistic routes. These arms are often routed through neighboring countries, such as Chad and Libya, to circumvent direct scrutiny and avoid detection. The SAF has publicly accused the UAE of carrying out drone strikes and providing military backing to the RSF, an allegation the UAE denies.
Thank you. Ms. Reus-Deelder?
I don't think I have anything to add to that at the moment. In the interest of time, nothing to add.
Could you maybe answer the questions which were appointed to you?
Absolutely. Let me address...
And Ms. Zainelabdin, could you please put off your microphone? Thank you.
Let me address Ms. Dobbes' question around sexual violence first. Your question was twofold, I believe. One, what is the importance of documentation? And two, what can we do more, if I understood you correctly? The concept, impunity is a terrible thing. And just to give you an example, the last genocide in Darfur, 2003, only one person has been convicted, only recently, only a few months ago. And it is widely believed that many of the perpetrators are now, in fact, still holding high positions within both the RSF and SAF and other warring parties. And impunity is a terrible thing for two reasons. One, because it strips women and children of their dignity, and it strips them of their sense of justice. But it also it ensures that history can be repeated. Because the perpetrators, because it's easy to get away with such heinous crimes. So that's the importance, and that's why I stress that. At the moment, obviously, protection is one of the most underfunded areas of humanitarian aid. We set out what Tawila looks like at the moment. I believe there are estimated to be about 700,000 people there. And if you only concentrate on very narrow definitions of what life-saving is, and you only concentrate on food and water, and you don't take in the protection aspect, then you will get more incidents of sexual violence. If you don't ensure sufficient funding and sufficient access for humanitarian organizations who can, for instance, put the water supply in a place where women can access it safely and don't have to walk for miles to get water, then you will have more incidents of sexual violence. So it's very simply a question of access and funding and giving priority to protection.
Thank you. Mr. McNally.
Yeah, I would second that, especially in terms of the allocations that are necessary for protection, and that this continues to be severely underfunded. I might add to that, ensure, and you touched on this, but ensure that a significant allocation also reaches the community-based organizations and the local providers of care. It is local communities that provide the vast majority of life-saving care and are actually attending to survivors in the first instance most of the time. And there's many of these groups that do not have the technical capacity, and likely will not in the near future, to engage with the pooled country fund, which is where other more established NGOs draw money from. And I think it is by ensuring that these resources reach the ground and real frontline providers of care that more assistance will immediately reach to survivors as well. And then this needs to be done alongside a push to really scale up the international response and insist on UN presence in some of these areas as well, but while prioritizing the local response all along the way.
Thank you. I'm not sure all the questions are answered, but maybe they will come back in the second round.
I would like to answer.
Mr. van Baarle, perhaps?
Yes, of course.
If I may?
Yes, Ms. Reusdeelde.
Yeah. So you asked, I believe, about the role of the host communities and what we can do to support them better. Thank you for that question. Actually, I very specifically brought up the host communities because I believe they're not recognized sufficiently what they do. And one woman I spoke to said, yeah, I said, why did you take some to your house? She said, well, that's the Sudanese way. And so thank you for picking that up in my plea. There are a lot of ways we can support the host communities. One of them is to ensure that we, again, I think it's also a question of broadening your definition of what humanitarian aid is, and ensuring that you also build in elements of resilience and rebuilding, reconstruction, making sure people get their livelihoods back. I spoke to one woman who was severely violated sexually, and I said, what do you need most? And she said, a battery, so I can restart my business. And she also needed medical care, but it was harder for her to talk to about. But that is what we should be doing. I think working with local responders, with local civil society organizations who are in those host communities, who know the host communities, who know where the needs are, and also making sure that we repair what has been damaged. I mean, to give the example of schools, a lot of the schools were used as IDP camps, camps for internally displaced persons. They need to be rebuilt. Every month that a girl stays out of school, she runs the risk of child marriage, teenage pregnancy, and never getting back into school. So it's, I'm sorry to say, again, a question of funding, but also a question of broadening your definition of how humanitarian aid works.
Ms. Saine Labdin, you wanted to add something?
I want to answer the question about the sexual violence, the strategy combat conflict related to the sexual violence, CRSV in Sudan. So the conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV, in Sudan, particularly in the systemic use of rape and sexual assault by the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, is not a byproduct of war, but a deliberate tactic of terror and domination. Addressing this requires a comprehensive multi-phase strategy built on pillars and protection, accountability, and prevention, with a survivor-centered approach as its core. So, for example, like protection, immediate and survivor-centered response, and also accountability, ending impunity, and prevention, addressing root causes of militarism. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Eiweiter.
Thank you. Yeah, in response also to the question of Mr. Van Baarle on the budget. So there is an opportunity here with the coalition forming and in negotiations on the budget. And we've already had a commitment from the parties that are currently in the negotiations to restore the 0.7% link between the gross domestic product and development aid. So I think that is already a hopeful sign. And humanitarian aid is part of that, but it's not going to be enough, as the gap between the humanitarian needs and the humanitarian funding globally has been widening and increasing for years. And in addition, we've also seen that in the past year, it hasn't been just a matter of the budget cuts, it's also been a matter of shifting priorities in policies that are prioritizing our own interest and the interest of the Netherlands private sector over the needs of the people on the ground. And we don't consider that strategy to be necessarily very effective, as well as ethical. So for us, it's also about looking at where can we shift the priorities in the policies that we develop in the Netherlands to really be center people first, as opposed to our own private interest, and ultimately, dedicate the funding to where that is needed most, to strengthen also indeed resilience on the ground of host communities, public services, etc. So those for us would be a priority, and I think a good opportunity now with the negotiations for the coalition.
Thank you. Well, if it's very short.
Very short on the budget, and I completely agree with Maaike, but I'd like to add one thing. The Netherlands did one thing very, very right 10 years ago when they founded the Dutch Relief Alliance and allowed for multi-annual flexible funding. And I think you can see that when you look at the situation in Sudan, that flexibility in that long-term perspective is very much needed. So I think more funding like that would help humanitarian organizations in all countries to function, to be effective and efficient when they intervene.
Thank you very much. Then we're going to the other members of parliament for their questions. Maximum of 2 questions in this round. And I would like to ask you to ask it to one of the guests, because then it's more clear. So I first give the floor to Bamengo of the Democrats 66.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Yes, I think it was Ms. Eiweiter who talked about the migration deals. So I would like to ask a question about that. What is the relationship or the complicity of the Netherlands, if we talk about relationship, the migration deals in relationship to Sudan? Yesterday I was in a meeting and I heard about the Khartoum process and the role of the Netherlands within that. So could you maybe tell us more about the complicity of the Netherlands towards that? And the second question is, I think it was Miss Roos Dilden who told us about the protection, and we should give more priority on protection. I just wanted to know, how does that look like? If it's not about food, it's not about medication, it's not about water, how does it look like to give more priority on protection?
Thank you so much. Mrs. Van Ark from the Christian Democrats.
Thank you. I have two questions. One question is for Mr. McNally. You said that the next El Fasher is on the way. Could you be a bit more concrete on that and elaborate a bit more how fast do you expect, or does the community actually expect the next big thing to happen that we should know about? That's my first question, and the other question is to Mrs. Roos-Deelder. The Dutch Relief Alliance is offering psychosocial help. Can you elaborate more on that? Is the Dutch Relief Alliance one of the only parties that is currently offering this type of support, or are there more organizations that are supporting this?
Thank you. Mr. Hogeveen of Ja21.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also have a question to Ms. Roos-Deelder and another question for Mr. McNally. But I would also like to thank you for telling us these moving but also horrific stories. It's always good for us as members of Parliament to know what's happening on the ground. So thank you for that. My question is about we hear a lot about the crisis in Sudan, about the need for safe humanitarian corridors. But we also hear that humanitarian corridors in Sudan are either controlled by one of the warring parties, so it's very difficult in order to set them up. What concrete options are there on the ground in order to set up some form of humanitarian corridors? And is it also, could airdrops in Sudan be an option, more than a symbolic relief, but also as a measure of last resort in order to at least give some life-saving needs in order to make an impact on the most vulnerable on the ground? Thank you.
And is the last question also to Ms. Roos-Deelder?
Oh, sorry, the first was to Roos-Deelder and the second to Mr. McNally on the airdrops.
Thank you. Thank you. Then I first like to give the floor to Ms. Awater.
Thank you for that question. On the Khartoum process, yeah, I mean, this was a similar type of migration deal where the EU indeed collaborated with the Sudanese authorities at the time to curb migration or to stop migration flows coming to Europe. The role of the RSF in controlling migration at the border or border control has been, I think, widely documented also to have been very include a lot of human rights abuses as well, and that has been extremely concerning. And for the EU, for the EU's funding to contribute to that, I think that implies again that question of complicity. The EU's response has been that they haven't directly funded the RSF with the money that was part of that deal. Counter arguments have been that it's been very difficult to track where the money has actually ended up from that within that process, and that it's therefore difficult to say that it hasn't ended up in the RSF's hands. Let's say also because of the big role that they have played in border control at the time. I don't know if that clarifies a bit the process, or if there's any follow-up questions on that.
I think it's very clear, seeing the members of Parliament nodding. We're going to Ms. Roos-Deelder. Yes.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the question. I think, Mr. Bamenga, you asked the question, what does protection actually look like? I gave a specific example in my introduction of the coffee corner that is actually a protection space. But I think, generally speaking, what is required, and especially required in the camps that are now increasing so much in size and where there's so little supervision, when you talk about protection, you talk about what we call child-friendly spaces. There are many unaccompanied children arriving in these camps that need protection. Women need a safe space where they can go, where they can ensure that they will not be violated. Psychosocial support comes into play too. I have to say, I could give examples like I gave in my introduction several times. I could sit here all evening talking about the women who experience sexual violence along the way, and they need that form of protection. I think it also should be about ensuring access to reproductive health services and information, but also the services themselves. There's a whole list, but I think very often protection is underfunded, and we, within our flexible funding, can ensure as much money as possible goes to these services. But as I said, generally speaking, the humanitarian effort in Sudan is woefully underfunded. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And then Mr. McNally.
Thanks for the questions. On the question of when will the next Al Fashir be, or how does that look? Of course we don't know, but I think I want to point out that I think that this is precisely the right question. I don't think it's a question of if. I think it's a question of when. And I would say that my sense is that it probably correlates best to the level of action or inaction we see now, right? If we see that there's no consequences for what has taken place, then of course we should expect to see it much sooner, right? I think that and so we don't know. We see the immediate consolidation, and this is a major advantage. This provides major advantages, and we see the immediate expansion of the front line into the Kordofans and then also to the north, and we see where we're already hearing very harrowing accounts of this taking place. So I think so long as the supply lines remain constant, and from everything that we hear, we assume that they are. And if so long as self-declared humanitarian champions are more preoccupied with the economic negotiations that are taking place, instead of trying to insist on that we rein in these abuses, then again we're likely to see it much sooner. I think with the current status quo and the way things are currently going, sooner than later, unfortunately. I can quickly address the other questions.
Yes, if you may, yes.
That were also put to me. On the question of airdrops specifically, this is MSF does not have a lot of experience in air ops and especially airdrops, so we're probably I'm probably the wrong person to answer this. In the limited experience we do have, indeed, it is very difficult to make them efficient, right? Especially relative to the cost of running them. Again, we don't have air ops, so these are figures from other responses, but sometimes it can take several weeks, if not even more than a month, to achieve what you can get in one 40-truck convoy, right, of running air ops twice a day, every day for up to like 7 to 8 weeks. You can achieve that in one convoy if you're moving it on the ground. So I think a lot of times the air ops have more of a symbolic effect indeed. And they may be impactful in other areas, moving personnel or other certain supply, but when we need to move the large amounts that we do, less efficient indeed.
Shall I add to that? So I'll start from the bottom up on my question, just to add to the airdrops, and completely agree with Kyle. I think the other thing to bear into account with airdrops is when there is a famine, when children and women are in IPC 4, IPC 5, simple food is not enough. It's not enough to throw a bag of flour out of a plane. They need health care. If a child is suffering from famine, that means the child will die if they're not properly treated. And you need very specific treatment and food for that sort of thing, for that situation. So in that sense, airdrops can be very counterproductive. And you also saw in other humanitarian settings, obviously, where airdrops also create a danger of looting, people actually getting killed through those airdrops. But I think in the case of Darfur Tawila now, an airdrop would not alleviate the suffering and the hunger of children and women in IPC 4 or 5. Sorry, looking at my scribbles here. Ms. van Ark, you asked a question about psychosocial support, and are we the only ones? Is the Netherlands the only ones at the Dutch Relief Line? No, luckily not. I have to say that about 10 years ago, the Netherlands was really leading the way when it came to recognizing the need of psychosocial support in humanitarian settings. I'm very happy that more countries are following, more interventions are happening there. But what it requires for people to seek and to accept psychosocial care is a longer-term invention. You need social workers that have the trust of the communities, that have the trust of the people living in the refugee camps, and building that trust and removing the stigma of seeking mental and psychosocial support is an intervention that is very much needed, but is a very delicate and time-consuming intervention. Let me see, my handwriting is awful. Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Hoogveen, you asked around the need for safe humanitarian corridors. I hope Kyle can help me a little bit here too, and how to set them up. You know, this is where humanitarian diplomacy comes in, and that is what Holland has always excelled at. We need pressure on all warring parties to adhere to international humanitarian law. Obviously, we're not seeing that at the moment in Sudan. In fact, you know, civilian targets are being hit every single day. It's very dangerous to work in this setting globally. Last year was the most dangerous year for humanitarian aid workers anyway. But this is where humanitarian diplomacy and pressure on the warring parties comes in. Kyle, have anything to add?
Maybe I could just briefly add, and also just to of course add the disclaimer that we of course are not experts on humanitarian corridors, have no experience in setting them up, don't use them often. So I can speak to our understanding and our experience of this issue, especially as it relates to the freedom of movement and access. I would agree that what we need is pressure, right? And we need pressure on the warring parties. Indeed, a corridor would be very difficult to establish when you have belligerent warring parties on all sides. This is very much a war on the people of Sudan by all the warring parties involved. And so it would be very difficult to rely on a belligerent party to somehow enforce or maintain a corridor, and we don't really have any other viable options that at least I'm aware of. And so the other thing I might say about this, though, is I think that needing a corridor, establishing one, somehow exceptionalizes obligations that should be generalized anyways, right? People should have the ability to move freely. People should be able to flee this violence, and we should insist that the warring parties let them do that with or without a corridor established. Humanitarian actors should be able to move into these most affected areas without being attacked, right, or impeded or obstructed, again, without a corridor or without any other exceptional political agreement in place. If we just return to our basic and first principles that are enshrined in IHL and in international humanitarian law, then these provisions would already be made.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I can add, one of the things that strikes me,
We have a couple of minutes, so you
sorry,
can add something.
Is how complacent we have become as society on violation of international humanitarian law. I mean, take the example of the kindergarten that was bombed. Why are we not furious? Why are we not speaking up? I mean, because our silence, our complacency also makes it easier to commit the next violation of international humanitarian law.
Thank you so much, and I really have to conclude this session. I'm very, very sorry. But of course, we can always have contact with you in like other forums. I want to thank you all for your elaborate contributions. Thank you so much for coming here and answering all the questions. Thank you to the members of parliament. I'm going to continue in Dutch, very quick. Ik schors de vergadering voor 5 minuten, zodat we even kunnen wisselen naar de volgende ronde. Ik heet intussen ook even de heer Seder van de ChristenUnie welkom. En ik schors de vergadering voor 5 minuten. De vergadering is geschorst. Ik open weer de vergadering. We zijn bij elkaar voor het ronde tafelgesprek over de situatie in Soedan. We zijn aangekomen bij het tweede blok over de diplomatieke inzet. En ik zal nu overgaan tot Engels, omdat we een aantal Engelse gasten aanwezig hebben. Welcome everyone in the second round in the expert meeting for the situation in Sudan. And I welcome the guests, first of all, Mr. Kamal El-Sadiq. He's a Sudanese journalist active for the Sudan Media Forum and Radio Dabanga. I also welcome Frank Slijper. He is here in a digital mode. And he's from Pax voor Vrede, Annette Hofman from the Klingendaal Institute, and Li Fung of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Welcome to you all and welcome to the members of Parliament in the second round. First, we would like to take a test if it works. So maybe if the digital techniques all work. So I first want to ask one of the guests, maybe Mr. Slijper, if he can say something and if we can hear him. Well, that's not a really good sign. So maybe the technical staff could see if they could get it work. Can anyone nod if you hear me? Okay, no, there's no sound at the other side. So what I will do, we will just wait for 1 minute for the technical staff to find out what's going on. Can anybody hear me now? Nee. Okay, there seems still to be a problem with the technical. No, there are some technical problems, so we will try to solve them. And in the meantime, we will start with Mr. Kamal El-Sadiq for his contribution. Okay, in the meantime, we will continue with Mr. El-Sadiq, and he can give an introduction of 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Kamal El-Sadiq. I'm editor-in-chief of Radio Dabanga. Also, I'm a chairman of Sudan Media Forum. And thank you again for you having me. You already heard about the humanitarian catastrophe in my country. For those uprooted by the conflict, health and safety are the priorities. Access to reliable information become a matter of life and death. Guidance on preventing cholera, knowing where food is available or where routes are safe, it is a lifeline. Today, international journalists cannot enter Sudan, and local journalists are prosecuted. In this vacuum, Radio Dabanga, with the trusted local sources, has become an essential source of information for millions of Sudanese people. Dabanga the Banga had the support of the Dutch government for all this time, for which we are extremely thankful and hoping it can continue in the coming years. Founded in exile in 2008, the Banga has delivered a crucial health information during epidemic and serve as a trusted voice for international policy, expert, embassy, and NGOs. The Banga reporting even contributed evidence used by the International Criminal Court in the case against Ali Kosheb for atrocity in Darfur. He was sentenced to life imprisonment today, just a few kilometers from here. Since the war started, 90% of the Sudan media infrastructures has been destroyed. Hundreds of violations against journalists have been recorded, arrested, beatings, disappearances, and the killing of 33 journalists. 16 targeted especially because of their work. Thousands of media professionals lost their job and are in exile. The Banga is now the only Sudanese broadcaster with a national reach. This is important because the war zone, Kordofan and Darfur, did not have internet access since the war started. For displaced people without internet access, it is a shortwave radio and satellite broadcasted, provided, trusted, accurate, fair, and independent news and information. Other independent outlets exist, but many have been even more weakened by funding cuts. To strengthen the sector, the Banga helped create Sudan Media Forum, gathering 25 independent media to share content and coordinate effort. Both warring parties run fake websites, social media accounts, and partisan media outlets to spread biased information and hate speech. Their aim is to create confusion, inflame tensions, and divide the country. Horrific footage of atrocity circulated online, deepening trauma and fueling further violence. The Banga is a vital source for the Sudanese inside the country, able to counter such disinformation. We ask, therefore, for three things. One, continue Dutch support for independent media, ensuring fact-based information reaches those in need. Two, provide the technical support to help Sudanese media monitoring hate speech, track information, and securely store video evidence of abuses for future justice. Third, and we ask for your support to include independent media in the future scenario planning for democratic Sudan. We need to ensure that the independent media reform is built into any plan for the future civil-led government. Without trustworthy, independent information, Sudan cannot move towards peace, accountability, or democracy. With it, the Sudanese people have a chance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution. And now we're going to see how our guests in the live stream are doing and if they already hear us and if we can hear them. I see a thumb going up, so that's positive. Great, great, it works. Okay, then I would like to give the floor to Mr. Frank Slijper. He's from Pax for Peace. Mr. Slijper, the floor is yours. Only I can't see.
Thank you very much.
Yes, we can't see you. Is that the intention?
No, you should be able to see me. At least I can see myself from my screen.
Okay, here your video is blocked for us, so maybe you could see whether you could change. the button.
Yeah, I put it off and put it on again now. Not making any difference?
No, we can't see you, but we can hear you very clearly. So fire away with your introduction.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to speak here at this important roundtable tonight. It's a shame I can be there in person, as I'm now in Geneva, where I just attended a conference on arms trade and accountability, a topic that, of course, directly relates to this evening's discussion. I want to emphasize a few points that I raised in our position paper, and that's for over 30 years, there is an EU arms embargo that applies to all of Sudan. And for more than 20 years, there is a UN arms embargo in place for all warring parties in the Darfur region. Yet weapons continue to flow into Sudan and Darfur. Recently produced military equipment from countries such as Bulgaria, China, Iran, Russia, Serbia, Turkey, and the UAE have been used in Darfur. Some of it delivered directly to one of the warring parties, some of it via third countries, and in particular, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Action against arms suppliers is urgently needed, and the Netherlands can play a much stronger role in this. The current limited UN arms embargo must be better monitored and enforced. Violations must be addressed. It is also important that the UN arms embargo is extended to cover the entire country. The Netherlands could join forces with other EU countries and possibly the US and the UK to achieve this. It is clear that the UAE is a key supplier of weapons to the rapid support forces. There's also evidence that European military equipment is ending up in Darfur via the UAE, despite long-standing arms embargoes. It is high time to draw conclusions from the UAE's long history of UN arms embargo violations and its refusal to stop this. The Netherlands should therefore advocate within the EU for a stop of arms transfers to the UAE. Some more things the Netherlands can do: putting discussions on arms supplies to Sudan on the agenda of the Arms Trade Treaty for its next meeting here in Geneva in March. The Netherlands could ask clarifications from countries whose weapons have been seen and used in Darfur. It could advocate for stricter European arms export controls so that European weapons or their components are no longer diverted to end up with warring parties in Sudan. The Netherlands should freeze arms exports to all countries that directly supply weapons to Sudan. The Netherlands should support international investigations, including those focused on violations of the UN arms embargo and prosecution of all those responsible for war crimes in Sudan. Lastly, we have serious concerns about the recently started collaboration by Dutch company VDL with Emirati-owned company Milrem Robotics in the production of military robotic vehicles. Weapons from that same Emirati company called Edge are being used in Darfur, and it's highly cynical that Dutch military production also fills the pockets of a country so involved in the atrocities in Darfur. I thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Now I'd like to give the word to Ms. Annette Hofman. She's from the Klingendaal Institute.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
Wonderful. Thank you. Honourable Chair, Members of Parliament, thank you for organising this important meeting, for inviting me, and thank you to the previous speakers for their very important contributions. The magnitude of the suffering and destruction in Sudan which was aptly described by previous speakers, stands in sharp contrast with the toothless diplomatic engagement by the EU and its member states. This is concerning from an ethical perspective. It is also concerning with regard to the Netherlands' own foreign policy priorities. Since this war disrupts Red Sea shipping lines, threatens regional security, and fuels irregular migration. With the capture of El Fasher by the paramilitary RSF, the war has reached a new tragic low point. A tragic low point in terms of the scale and brutality of atrocities committed by the RSF and the immense suffering it continues to cause. In a private briefing to the UK Parliament, academics estimated last week that at least 60,000 people have been killed in the last couple of weeks in El Fasher alone. That is the equivalent of the population of Den Helder. As many of 150,000 remain unaccounted for. This is again only in El Fasher. Survivors have testified to a campaign of rape, murder that leaves piles of blood and bodies visible from space. The brutal takeover of El Fasher also signifies a tragic low point because of the absence of any meaningful international consequences. Yes, diplomatic statements of concern have been issued, half a dozen ceasefire and peace initiatives have been launched, but none of these efforts was able to pressure Sudan's generals to cease fighting, nor to persuade regional power brokers to push for a compromise. This is because far from everything has been tried to end the bloodshed. I'd like to use tonight's opportunity to highlight two entry points for more meaningful diplomatic engagement on Sudan, one that moves away from words alone and demands real leadership and tangible action. On the one hand, the Netherlands must escalate pressure on the external backers of Sudan's war and encourage the EU to do the same. They can do so by focusing on curbing arms flows from the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others, as was just mentioned. Secondly, by focusing on raising the costs of those benefiting from the gold trade that finances this war, including by sanctioning Sudanese and non-Sudanese-based entities facilitating this gold trade. And thirdly, by focusing on pushing for an implementation of the existing resolutions on Sudan, including the arms embargoes. In contrast, by sustaining Dutch arms exports to these intermediary countries, and by choosing to keep quiet about the solid evidence linking, in particular, the UAE's weapon supplies to the RSF's ongoing massacres, the Netherlands and the EU risk condoning future mass atrocities, and the ongoing ones as well. Let's be clear, there are many international actors fueling this war on both sides. Yet the genocidal violence we currently witness in Darfur and Kordofan could not be possible without the support of the United Arab Emirates. Rather than hushing up with the UAE's destabilizing role in the region, as done in the latest EU Parliament resolution on Sudan, the EU must use the ongoing negotiations of a free trade agreement with the UAE to demand compliance with the UN arms embargo and incentivize an end to fueling Sudan's war. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others who back the Sudanese armed forces should also be pressured to stop fueling this war. Now, on the other hand, the Netherlands and the EU should amplify the voice of civilians in any diplomatic engagement on Sudan. After a decade of supporting pro-democracy forces in the country, the Netherlands is uniquely positioned to more consistently do so. And yes, efforts to that effect exist, but they should do two things differently. One is to reach beyond those civilians who can easily access the usual conference halls in the region's capitals, and instead systematically involve Sudan's grassroots movements, such as the emergency response rooms, which evolved from the resistance committees that spearheaded the 2018 revolution. And secondly, consultations with civilians should also be more structurally connected to ceasefire negotiations, humanitarian access questions, accountability efforts that require the vital reporting of independent media platforms such as Dabanga and others. and of course consultations about fundamental governance issues that have to inform a political process towards democracy. As we gather here this evening, the war in Sudan rages on. Both belligerents continue to deliberately target civilians. After the massacres in Jenin, Kordofan, Jazeera, and Fasher, what else will it take for the Dutch government and the EU to step up diplomatic engagement and take the above actions to help end this war and prepare for lasting peace? It is both a moral imperative and in the interest of Dutch core foreign policy priorities to move from words of concern to high-level, targeted diplomatic engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Then we continue with Ms. Li Fung of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Ms. Li Fung, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good evening from Port Sudan. I think that what I want to emphasize is that the crisis in Sudan is first and foremost a human rights and protection crisis. I think you've just had a session on the humanitarian situation. It's the violation of international humanitarian law with blatant disregard for international law and with impunity that has triggered the world's largest humanitarian emergency. We have a quarter of the population displaced, half facing acute food insecurity and famine in El Fasher and in Kadugli in South Kordofan. 4 out of 5 children out of school. Over 70% of health facilities in conflict-affected areas which are not functional. And over 33 million people, that's 2/3 of the population, in need of humanitarian assistance. And this crisis is entirely human-induced. It is over 2.5 years of a brutal conflict conducted with utter disregard for international law. It's impunity that has enabled the repetition of horrific patterns of violations and abuses amounting to international crimes. And we're seeing the repeat of patterns of international crimes that were seen 20 years ago. And then the discrimination and division that's threatening the social fabric of this diverse nation, and that are manifesting themselves in hate speech and ethnically motivated violence. And what is driving it? It's economic interests. And also the continued flow of arms, which you've heard from the previous speakers, but it's also the economic interests in gold, in natural resources, that drive the interest to pursue this conflict. And I think that we need to look at how do we understand this better and disrupt it. In terms of what we have documented, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sudan, since the beginning of the conflict in April, and it's contained in the position paper, we're looking at indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas and infrastructure. And this is through drone strikes and increasingly the use of advanced weaponry, long-range drones that have been really mounting this year, and we've seen it. Artillery shelling, including more advanced artillery shelling, airstrikes, including the use of barrel bombs, and this has had such a catastrophic impact on the civilian population, and particularly I want to highlight now the Kordofan region. Our High Commissioner for Human Rights and our office have been warning about the Kordofan region since April, May of this year, and really now the situation is very critical. We've also seen summary executions, large numbers of summary executions of alleged collaborators as territory controls changes hands, ethnically motivated killings, and mass killings, for example, as what we have documented in El Fasher. In the past few weeks, we've deployed 2 teams, one to Eastern Chad, one to Northern State in Sudan. And what they have documented it's horrific. And it's really corroborating all of the reports that have been out there. And they're patterns of violations that we already documented in April 2025, when the RSF took Zamzam IDP camp near El Fasher, and similar patterns of ethnically motivated violations that we documented in late 2023, when the RSF took El Jenaina and Adamata in West Darfur. And this includes the widespread use of sexual violence as a weapon of war in an ethnically motivated and targeted way. We've also, in more broadly, outside also the conflict, the heavily conflict affected areas, we're seeing widespread arbitrary detention against opponents, against civil society, really reiterating what Kamala Sadiq said, that we need to protect civic space. We're seeing the shrinking of civic space. How do we find an inclusive and durable pathway out of this conflict if the space for freedom of expression, association, media freedoms is being shrunk? And then it's the conditions also in these massive places of detention across the country, and the impact of the conflict on economic and social rights, food, health, water, education, shelter. So what is needed? I mean, in a crisis of this scale, we need a multi-pronged and coherent approach addressing various areas. Firstly, we need to continue to press for accountability. And I think that the sentencing of Ali Khoshaib just today for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed 20 years ago is a positive step. It shows that accountability is possible, but we can't let the victims of today's violations wait that long. So I think that this is, and it's very momentous also that this has happened in The Hague. So I think that we need to all play this role and continue to press for accountability, and in different ways, also looking at transitional justice and the role that this plays. And what this needs is the continued documentation of the violations happening on the ground, to bear witness and to support future accountability efforts, but also to inform the response to the crisis. And this is what our office has been doing, working very closely with human rights defenders, with civil society, with journalists, with lawyers. I'm pleased to say also that the government of Netherlands has been supporting our work on this and our work together with civil society actors on this. Then we need to be able to support the response to the crisis, and the response in many ways. The humanitarian response, and the needs are huge, and you've heard this. The protection response, which means that we really need to look at protective efforts, also strengthening Sudanese civil society and local actors, local responders, and their role in the response, and the recovery efforts that are commencing in different parts of the country to be human rights based and inclusive. And then I would want to really highlight then the need for political action. And I think that without political action, all we can do is continue to call this out without seeing a change. I support what's been said by previous speakers on action on arms flows. I think we also need to really push for and support dialogue to reach a ceasefire, and look at also concrete actions, confidence building measures that will have a direct impact on the civilian population now, that can pave the way to the negotiation of a just, inclusive and durable peace. And then really press for addressing the drivers of the conflict, the arms embargo, the arms flows, the military support to those who then support the warring parties, but also the economic drivers that are fueling the continuation of this conflict. And then I'd also say, please just continue the advocacy, the voices, to be able to keep global and national attention on Sudan, to call for action to end the crisis, and to stand with the people of Sudan, to press for human rights and international humanitarian law to be upheld, and to support the engagement of Sudanese voices for peace and justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your contributions. And considering the time, I will now go to the questions of the members of parliament. And I want to ask you to ask one question, and then we do the whole round, and then we'll see if there is space for more questions. I would suggest that we start with the first 3 members of parliament, and then do the answering of these questions, and then continue. So I'd first like to give the floor to Sarah Dobbe of the Socialist Party.
Thank you very much for your contributions and your important work that you are doing. I have a question for Mr. El Sadiq, because you are from the Sudanese Media Forum as well, and we had discussions here in Parliament why this humanitarian conflict with so many people has remained so invisible all this time and the lack of good journalism reporting on this conflict. Can you share a little bit more about how local journalists are still able to get these stories, to work and to get the stories to the people that need to hear them?
Thank you. Mr. Van Baarle from the Denk Party for his question.
Thank you. I would like to ask Ms. Hoffman a question. With regard to sanctions, could you please make an international comparison to the best of your knowledge with regard to the actual sanctions that are being imposed against actors in Sudan and actors supporting the warring parties in Sudan, and maybe give examples of sanctions being imposed by other countries that we, as the Netherlands or as the European Union, could also impose? Are there examples which you can name that could be imposed against the warring parties and parties that support the warring parties? Thank you.
Thank you. Then the question of Mr. Bramenga of D66.
Thank you, Chairperson. I have a question to Ms. Hoffman, and the question is: in which way are civilians part of the peace process, and what do you think that if they are not involved? Could you please elaborate on how they should be involved? And could you please tell us more about what the Netherlands, in which way the Netherlands is or should be involved in this peace process?
Thank you so much. Then we go to the answers. First to Mr. El Sadiq. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Regarding the questions of the situation of the journalists in the ground in Sudan, as you know, the situation now in Sudan is very hot, and the journalists, according to the syndicate, there is about 3,000 Sudanese journalists, but 2,000 of them, because of war, have left their home. So they are all in neighboring countries, in Chad, in Egypt, in Ethiopia, so in neighboring countries. The others, there is a lot of restrictions from the warring parties. So as you call yourself as a journalist, so you are targeted from the different sides. And as I'm saying, there is, from the starting of the war until this time, there is 333 journalists killed. The last one of the journalists killed in Al-Fashir 2 weeks ago announced that his robber support targeting and killing him inside his house. And there is another thing also in Sudan, for example. This is a hot area. The war zone in Kordofan and in Darfur, it is completely out of internet. This is since the starting of the war. And also, it is out of electricity. So people using the Starlinks for communications. Yes, we are in Dabanga and in Sudan Media Forum, we are working all together. Because of these situations, we have one newsroom, joining newsroom. So through this newsroom, we're working together, sharing information, verifying with each other, together, and sharing with the expert and others, and communicate this information and verifying with the editor-in-chief of Sudan Media Forum. And this is sending to all Sudanese media. This is one of the way of this moment we're working for. Another thing is there is the resilience in Sudanese people. There is still people working there. And those are providing us with information. They are put themselves in dangers, but still they are still working on this. So even with this darkness of the situations, there is still photos, still there is pictures, even horrible pictures and videos is coming from them, from the portraitors itself, from the rapper support itself. They filming themselves and putting in the social media. So yes, the situation there is difficulties inside Sudan, but as a journalist, we know that, and we are working hard, and also the Sudanese people, citizens also, is sharing information, and we verify still whenever they have connections, and even if you have 1 cent, you're calling and to provide information and to tell what's going on. So this is the situations right now, unfortunate.
Thank you. Then I would like to give the word to Mrs. Hofman of the Klingendaal Institute for the answering of questions to her.
Thank you very much, and thank you for these excellent questions. On sanctions, Sudan under Bashir has lived for decades under sanctions, but these were blanket sanctions, and they've been quite harmful to the civilian population. The sanctions nowadays are much more sophisticated and can be very targeted on companies or individuals. The reason why sanctions have been not so effective is that there's been a lack of coordination between the sanctioning entities, the US, the EU, UK, Canada, and because there's been a lack of strategic use of sanctions, because there's been they haven't been used as a tool among other tools, the mediations, for instance, humanitarian aid, etc., but they've been used almost randomly, and whenever an evidence package was ready to identify an entity to be targeted. That is hugely problematic and weakens the effectiveness of sanctions. So any efforts, and there's quite a few out there, that continue to document human rights abuses and track the economic networks that were referred to earlier, for instance, around gold that finances this war, need to be supported in order to be ready with the right evidence packages in order to then really sanction in the most strategic way. So either to interrupt those economic networks or to make it politically very expensive for certain authorities or high-profile individuals to be sanctioned. The third element to make them more effective is that they need to be implemented. So while al-Fashir was under siege and negotiations were ongoing in Washington, Al-Ghoni, the relative of Hamiti himself, was hosted in Washington, although he was sanctioned by US sanctions. And that sends the wrong signal of saying, well, you know, even with these sanctions, they're not implemented strictly, so you shouldn't be too afraid. That needs to be avoided, of course. And in order to now improve the sanctioning and target the right people, I think today there's been a new round of sanctions by the US Treasury. It makes sense for the EU to follow suit promptly in order to make sanction evasion harder. So far in the past, we've seen that there's been a very discoordinated effort by these different countries or blocs such as the EU in sanctioning that can be improved in terms of timing things. And lastly, it is important that we move to sanctioning entities that are based outside of Sudan, and that includes the gold hub, where 90% of the gold of Sudan ends up to, and that is in the United Arab Emirates. And clearly also there is logistical supporting entities that help to bring in the weapons and bring in mercenaries from Colombia, for instance, that has been well documented. And I think we need more investigations to then also come through with sanctions that target these nodal points that often are outside of Sudan. And that's on sanctions. Maybe I can answer the civilian question as well, if that makes sense.
Yes, please continue with that answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and great question. So how should civilians be involved? I think what has been missed is that civilians can play a crucial role, for instance, in monitoring ceasefires. As we heard in the earlier sessions, civilians play the most powerful role in delivering humanitarian aid. They need to be on the forefront when discussing how aid is being delivered, how much goes into cash transfers and directly to local organizations, for instance, rather than through the UN and international organizations and bigger local NGOs. They also need to have a say when the UN discusses its cooperation agreement with Port Sudan authorities, for instance. The EU, the Netherlands, can use its connections to mutual aid group, emergency response rooms to get their feedback on such documents. And the same even at the highest level for the Quds roadmap that was launched in September. Donors can play a role in seeking feedback from those civil society organizations, not just at the highest level, the political party leaders, but also at the local level, those, again, who struggle to attend those nice conferences that are being organized in the region because they are stuck inside the country, busy helping people survive. So I think that is how the involvement in these various areas, humanitarian aid, ceasefire monitoring, and of course, importantly, the political process and the design of Sudan's political future, they have to be involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to go to the other members of parliament for their questions. Mrs. Van Ark of the Christian Democrats.
Yes. I have a question for Mrs. Lee Fung. My question, you advocate also for supporting local civil society organizations. Of course, funding is important, but how do you think local civil society organizations should be more supported, and what could be their role according to you?
Thank you. Mr. Hoogeveen of JA21.
Thank you. And my question is to Ms. Annette Hofman. And my question is about the how the battlefield is evolving in Sudan. Mainly that we have seen that the fall of al-Fashir, of course, in Darfur, lately also in Bab Nusa in West Kordofan. And today I read an article that the biggest oil field of Sudan is now also in the hands of the RSF. So my question is, what is your expectation on how this battlefield is evolving, how this war is evolving? Obviously, it's a bit of a question that you might not have a very concrete answer to, but I'm interested either way. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Seder of the Christian Union.
Thank you so much, and also for your contributions. I was wondering, in light of all the other questions that were asked, if you could advise us on how to deal with the humanitarian aid or the people who are currently, who have fled currently to the nearby countries like Egypt. You know, there's a group of Sudanese people who are there as refugees, but I was wondering how we can also help facilitate those, and knowing that also the humanitarian situation there, I know that there aren't any official camps. Maybe that's something where the Dutch can also help. So I was wondering, I don't know who's adequate to answer that question, but that's something in light of, and in addition to all the other questions, something where we maybe also can help those people there. Thank you.
Maybe we could ask Mr. Slijper of PAX and anybody who wants to respond to that. All right, then we will start with Mrs. Lee Fung for her answer.
Thank you. In relation to how we can support local civil society organizations. I think that there's multiple ways, and I think that yes, funding is key. And for example, for the emergency response rooms and the community kitchens, mutual aid groups, funding is key. And it's really, but at the same time, it's needed to be accompanied by the capacity building. It's the work that we've been doing throughout the conflict to really build the capacities of civil society networks in various ways in how to engage with the international community as well and raise their voice. But also, I think that we also need to look at protective action. And this is where it's been very important that when there have been threats to civil society organizations, it's being able to speak out, because the public pressure on them increases the protection for them. And this has been the case for various members of the emergency response rooms, for journalists, for lawyers who have faced difficulties. I think that it's also important to be able to promote the role and the voice of civil society. And I think this comes back to the question in the previous round about the role of the civil society and civilians in the peace process. And I think that we need to look at how the voices and the inclusion in the peace process are actually representative and inclusive of Sudan. So that means young people. It means diversity of regions and of perspectives. And I think that these are the things that can be encouraged to really encourage civil society to play a role. Also to advocate for the space to be open. Look at the issues of the restrictions on registration, on detention, call those out. So I think I'll leave it there, but just also to say that if you would like me to speak to later on the issues about the humanitarian aid and the refugees in neighbouring countries, it's something that we do work on, I can, and also happy to share also our perspectives on the ground on the evolution of the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lee Fong. Then I will give the floor to Mrs. Hofman.
Thank you very much for the question regarding the battlefield and how it is evolving. We know almost too much to doubt that this war will rage on unless it is stopped with highest political pressure, because both parties are clearly determined to go for military victory, which all analysts I talk to think is impossible. So that means that the battlefield will continue and intensify. We see that both parties have increased their weapon supplies, and that also, forespells that the battles will increase. And thirdly, we need to think about the intentions of the sponsors of the two main warring factions. And I remember very well when al-Fashir was taken, we got a lot this question of, oh, so might this mean a split up of the country or formalization of an already split country into two, the so-called Libya scenario. And I think that was misleading, because never was the intention by the RSF to limit itself to the Darfur region. I think it is clear that the sponsor behind the RSF has not just interests in the gold in Darfur, but is also interested in fertile land in other parts of the country, is interested in control over the Red Sea, which is all the way on the eastern side of Sudan. And therefore, we are not surprised to see that quickly after the fall of al-Fashir, battles have intensified in Kordofan, the region that links al-Fashir towards the east and the capital, Khartoum. So we've seen a very rapid escalation of violence in Kordofan. You were rightly pointing out that the strategic, very important, economically and politically important oil fields in Heglich have been captured by the RSF. And that forespells that, I think, after that the RSF now controls basically Western Kordofan, that we'll see a further intensification of the battles in the Kordofan region at large. Yeah, I leave it there. And a comment on Egypt, maybe very important that the EU and member states use their engagement with Egypt, for instance, on a migration deal, as was mentioned earlier, to urge the Egyptian Authority to treat Sudanese refugees with respect and to adhere to international standards, and to include monitoring, independent monitoring, for this to actually happen before proceeding with the migration deals. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anybody of the guests want to add something to the question of the answer of the question of Don Seder about the refugees in Egypt? Ms. Li Fung?
Yeah, I can add. I mean, I think that it's not just the refugees in Egypt. I think that in Egypt it's particularly difficult, and I think that one of the things that that can be pressed for is to look at ensuring that people are able to renew their documentation wherever they may be. That means their passports, because there's been numerous cases of individuals who have not been able to renew their documentation. Is protecting those fundamental rights, even if you're in exile. I'd say that also it's the issue of returns, because I think there's a lot of pressure on returns, whether it be from neighboring countries or even internally. So returns to Khartoum, to Al Jazeera, to Sennar, places which are not ready to really host people, returning people in a way that's really human rights based. And I think that we need to really press against forcible returns, and it's happening a lot in Egypt, but also to recognize that there's still a refugee population in Sudan that Sudan has hosted for decades. And we're seeing the pressure on South Sudanese, Eritrean, and Ethiopian refugees who are living in Sudan, who've been living in Khartoum. They're being forced towards camps along the borders in different states. And that's a difficult situation as well. And I did want to just comment also on the evolution of the conflict. As Ms. Hoffman said, West Kordofan is now completely controlled by the RSF. The SPM North is closing in on Kadugli in South Kordofan, an extremely critical town. And they've indicated their intention publicly that Kadugli and Dillinj will fall. And these are two besieged towns where famine has been detected in Kadugli, and there's risk of famine in Dillinj. And from there, they will move northwards towards El Obeid, which is also partly in siege conditions in North Kordofan. And from there, I don't think that they will stop at control of, let's say, the western part of the country. From El Obeid, it's a very easy move towards Khartoum again. And that was hard fought to be able to control Khartoum. I was just there 10 days ago. The destruction is still evident. It has not been rebuilt. And I think that I also want to highlight the impact of the long-range drone weaponry that we have seen since May. With this technology, it changes completely the face of warfare. You don't need to be close to your targets. You can hit Port Sudan from across the other side of the country, and you can hit critical civilian infrastructure, airports, electricity plants, water stations, refineries. And that is a different way of disrupting civilian life and conducting the warfare, which I think is extremely dangerous. It comes back to the arms race. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Li Fung. Unfortunately, I already have to close this meeting. We are at the end, and I want to thank all the guests for their valuable contributions to this expert meeting. We have a debate tomorrow evening, so it's very useful input for this debate for all the Parliament members. I want to thank all the members of Parliament for asking all the questions, and I hereby close this gathering. Thank you.